This is how Swansea town centre looked before the outbreak of the Second World War. St Mary's Church can be seen in the centre of the picture. But this all changed when the German Air Force, whose name was the Luftwaffe, was to launch an attack on Swansea. And I was 12 years of age and living in a working class area of Swansea known as Landor. And it was spread around that war had been declared as a result of the Germans invading Poland. The first bombing I experienced was in the locality where I live. I lived in this area called Landor, but nearby there was an area called Penvilla. And above Penvilla Road there was a street called Bryn Street. And the first bomb in that area of Swansea landed in Bryn Street in the garden of a house where 5 people were seeking safety in an Anderson shelter. There were the grandfather and grandmother, the daughter and son-in-law, and the little boy, the grandchild. And the 5 were killed by a bomb in Bryn Street. Then that salvo of bombs allowed the second bomb to land in Silo Road at the junction with Silo Crescent, where I went to live when I got married, actually, years later. And there were 5, again, area wardens standing in a group discussing this and that, and a bomb landed right in the middle of them, killing the 5 of them. I remember Mr. Jones, Mr. Williams, Mr. Walker, and so on. And then the third bomb landed in Argo Terrace, but the next 4th bomb landed down near the viaduct, where no doubt the Germans were trying to destroy. And it landed on 2 or 3 men coming home to Clitach from a dance in Swansea. So that's all that salvo of bombs did, was to kill ordinary civilians without any assistance to winning the war. But that was my first local experience. And I well remember the following morning, I was standing in Clayton Street with a group of men who were discussing the dreadful damage and the deaths that had been caused. And a man named Aubrey Powell, who was a deacon in New Silo Chapel, said, "Hubert, it was a night of hell. It was a night of hell." The words are embossed upon my memory. I can always remember Aubrey Powell saying, "A night of hell." And it was a night of hell. We'd never experienced anything like this before. We'd seen it on the films and we'd read about it. But here, in our own little locality, were our neighbours being blown to pieces. A nightmare of a situation. But that was my first experience locally of bombing. As a 12-year-old boy, I didn't anticipate any big changes in my lifestyle. Little did I know that my whole world and that of my neighbours and relatives would be completely revolutionised, because this was the entry into a period of carnage and warfare which was indescribable. Swansea was destroyed practically to each building. And that was how I first heard of it. In Sadler Street, Landor, the word went round, "War has been declared." Well, I had been a member of Swansea 24th Scout and Cub Troop for several years. First of all, I was a cub, and I well remember my mother scraping together money to buy a uniform for me, which she bought in Page Street at the junction with Mansell Street. And we walked down Page Street, and I insisted on going into Northampton Lane to put my uniform on. I couldn't wait to have my cap and badge on. So I was a cub then, and then I became a scout. And we held our meetings in the basement of Wesley Methodist Church, which was in College Street, where Princess Way is at the moment. We used to go down in the basement of the church, a huge church, and practice making knots. And I was even selected to give a demonstration with several other senior scouts in the Central Hall, Swansea. Now, the Central Hall was located more or less where the Dragon Hotel is now. And Lord Somers, who was a chief scout, came to Swansea, and there were half a dozen of us, including myself, were designated to give a demonstration of semaphore with a flag in each hand. It's as clear as could be, even now after all these years. But as a result of being in the scout troop, Swansea 24th, I repeat, I was in fact selected to be a civilian service, civil defence messenger. I had to have a good bike, and they provided me with a steel helmet. They provided me with a gas respirator, civilian service type, and an armband designated my authority. And it is my job which I was excited about, of course, to carry messages from various civil defence centres. One centre was the Central Police Station in Alexandra Road, where at the time, this was 1939, they were filling the windows with sandbags in anticipation of bombing. But believe me, we didn't think it had come to the actual bombing. Anyway, that was one of the centres, the Central Police Station, and another two were Northampton Buildings, not far from the junction with Christiana Street, and Unit Superheaters in Haverdishire. And I had to stop for hours in these various locations until a message came through to be delivered. And then I cycled to a specific destination because the buildings were crumbling everywhere. There were the bombs being dropped, hundreds of incendiary bombs. And this is my job. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but sadly, one of my colleagues, another messenger, got killed by a bomb. When I think of it, I was 12 years of age, but suddenly I had to assume the clothing of an adult. I was given very important jobs to do, although really I was a child. But it's surprising how stress and danger matures one. And I became a man overnight, more or less, because I saw some dreadful things in the streets as a result of the bombing. We even had a period when Swansea was strafed by a low-flying aircraft in the afternoon. Several dockers were killed, and I was able to hide in an archway in the railway station in Landau on my way home. But they were very hard days, but I was excited and very proud to be a civil defence messenger. And as I say, I was only 12 at that particular time. Apart from the fatality of this ambitious and this caring young man, there were other messenger boys who were injured by shrapnel and falling debris from buildings. I haven't got in my mind, that's a long time ago, their names, but it was an extremely difficult and dangerous task to cycle around, and we couldn't cycle far, you see, without getting off the bike, because the road surface was covered with bricks and stones and glass, metal, all manner of foreign bodies, so one had to pick up the bike, put it on your shoulder, and scramble over the bomb damage to reach your destination. A very hazardous job, but nevertheless very rewarding. There have been several people who badly injured in the centre of Swansea, and they needed a lot of first aid. And the appropriate authorities, the civil defence workers who were dealing with injuries, didn't have sufficient first aid. So I had to take a message to the Central Police Station to urgently supply bandages and drugs to a location where all these unfortunate victims of bombing took place. So we were lifesavers in the full respect of the word, delivering first aid, delivering vehicles, because vehicles were being damaged by bombs, important messages, and unable to contain these and convey them because the telegraph wires were damaged, so they relied on word of mouth, and this is what we did. Yes, well, there was a revolution of changes in Swansea. First of all businesses had their windows sealed with adhesive tape, and windows then were filled with sandbags. There was a tremendous amount of concern with housewives about the impending rationing, and so there was a tremendous demand for corned beef and various other tin goods to stack up for what they anticipated would be a long siege with rationing. So grocery shops and everybody had queues with housewives spending every penny they could to build up their reserves of food. Then again, places of entertainment, like cinemas, had special announcers in there, so that when the bombing commenced, the film would be stopped, and the usherette or whoever, the manager, would get on to say, would anybody who wished to go home please leave now? The air raid warning alert has gone, but if you are going, please leave in an orderly manner, and you will be informed when the all clear comes. And then lots of people would make their way home because they were frightened, and good reason as well. But then at the end of the period of danger, the all clear would sound, and again the manager or usherette would go to say, I'm pleased to inform you now that the all clear is gone, so you can relax in your seats. It was, and incredibly, because of the lack of hygiene in that period, a man used to walk around the cinema with a spray spraying over the audience to kill germs, because the hygiene had gone right down. Soap was rationed, and there were lots of diseases like impetigo and various other diseases associated with dirtiness. So I always remember this woman walking around and spraying us all with these antiseptic gases, you know. Prior to the Blitz, you had bombing. You would have approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, the siren would go, warning that outside of war danger. So all families then would retire to their Anderson shelter, which was built in the garden. And we, like others, they went down there. My mother made sure we had 6 candles with us, which were lit in there because we had no lighting, of course. So we took candles. And often my mother took some kippers in there. And she had a little stove she could cook kippers on. But you can imagine the heat and the perspiration in a little safety shelter like the Anderson, with the smell of kippers wafting out. I often thought it is the one that didn't drive the German Luftwaffe away. So then you'd sit in that Anderson shelter until the all clear was sounded, which was usually about 1 or 2 in the morning. And then you'd retire to a proper bed. But it became such an experience that you became accustomed to it, and we didn't see it strange at all. There was another shelter distributed amongst civilians for interior use. It is built into the center of a dwelling room, and it had reinforced sides, and they could go underneath there. The problem was the house would come on top of that. So they weren't the satisfactory situation, really, but you had to try to save lives. And in fact, later on, when we were evacuated to Pontardawe, 7 miles up the Swansea Valley, my father was offered timber by the War Department to build his own shelter, which he did in the, what we call in Welsh, Cwtstan Star, a cwtch under the stairs. And he built wooden structure there to give it a lot of strength again. Ironically, that part of Pontardawe never had any bombing. But everybody was expected to do what they could in the War Department. My father, in fact, became a wartime police officer. I have lots of photographs of him. He was also a member of the Pontardawe Police Glee Party, and they went around giving concerts to various groups of people who were frightened to death of the bombs, but at least they had the solace of having the singing policemen, giving them confidence and hope. I remember on one occasion I had a friend named John Llewellyn who lived in Freeman Street, Bryn Hyfryd, about a quarter of a mile from my home in Saddle Street. And John and his father, Charlie, who was an engine driver, and his sister were very happily living in Freeman Street. And I went across in the afternoon, late afternoon, this particular day, and John and I played out the back of the house, and then we went in and had played dominoes and ludo games, you know, snakes and ladders. And then the alarm went. Well, I thought it may be a short period, because sometimes we had a brief period of alarm when an aircraft came over and then went away. But this alarm continued in a state of danger. So Mr. Charlie Llewellyn said to me, "You better go home, Hubert. Go on, go home now when it's quiet." So I went up Freeman Street into Llangavelach Road, where there's a pub called the Morris Arms. It's still there. And now a bomb landed down near Bryn Hyfryd School, only about 300 yards from me. And the landlord came out and grabbed my arm and said, "Don't be so damn soft, young man, come in here." And he dragged me into the pub. I hasten to say I didn't have a drink. I was only a lad then of about 13. And I was hiding under the counter in the Morris Arms in Llangavelach Road. But he possibly saved my life, but his intentions were good when he dragged this young boy who was foolishly making his way home in a street which was illuminated by searchlights, I hasten to say. Can you imagine? Everything was blackout to start with. Vehicles had their masks put on their headlamps to put the beam down onto the ground. And then you had air raid wardens who were there to ensure that people observed these regulations. And in fact, you could be fined quite heavily for failing to black out your house. We were reported. And my Auntie Gladys, a spinster of the parish, was approached by P.C. Buffton in Landor and reported for not drawing the curtains of the house fully. There was a chink of light going out, which could be seen, they said, by the pilots of the Luftwaffe. So poor Gladys, who was a law-abiding, hard-working spinster, was on the criminal records for disclosing light, unnecessarily. And P.C. Bufton made a note in his notebook. The first indication that there was a great need for action to be taken was when there was a list made of children who were to be evacuated. My friend Hayden Evans, who lived in Pennyworth Terrace near me, was one of many who were allocated accommodation in country areas. So Hayden, with two brothers named Grove, whose father was a policeman actually, were evacuated to a little village outside Carmarthen, and in a farmhouse there they were made welcome for the entire period, including the Blitz, because the government were concerned that young people were being killed, and so rather than to allow that to happen, they evacuated them and allocated them in private houses. I was not evacuated by the government because my father worked in the steelworks in Pontardawe, and therefore it is obvious he was commuting back and forth to Landor, so he got us all into the James bus and took us to Pontardawe and found us accommodation with his mother, my grandmother, known as Mam Gee, in Call Road. So we went and lived with my Mam Gee whilst the Blitz was on in Swansea, those 3 nights. And from the back garden where my grandmother kept a pig and poultry and grew all her vegetables, you could see Swansea was a mass of flames. The whole area around Swansea, the sky was full of light with the explosions that went with it, and there were hundreds and hundreds of fires which had been started by the incendiary bombs. In fact, when I was in Pontardawe, I became friendly with a boy named Vivian Gibbs, and we both joined the ATC. It was a local squadron, and we learnt to do Morse code. It is part of the training, and we used to go over the mountain between Ashtwen and Neath and collect unexploded incendiary bombs and parts of aircraft. They had a pseudo town on the mountain there between Pontardawe and Neath to give the impression to the Luftwaffe that that was Swansea. And they had, so we used to go collecting incendiary bombs, would you believe it, and putting them on bonfires to burn, and they were full of phosphorus. They give a tremendous heat off, but we never got injured, fortunately. Nearly all the centre of Swansea town was destroyed. There are lots of photographs now showing the destruction. It was immense. It in fact extended from Castle Street down to where the Plaza Cinema was. It was completely flattened, and in fact it has destroyed so much that Goat Street, which was below the level of Castle Street, had a bridge built by the Army engineers but to take pedestrians from Castle Street down into Goat Street. But the only buildings standing still in Castle Street were the shells of buildings on the east side of Castle Street, which have now been rebuilt, of course. There was a famous store called Ben Evans. It was located where Castle Gardens eventually went, and it's a place now where people like to sit down and chat in the sun. Well, now Ben Evans was probably one of the biggest departmental stores in Wales. It was immense. It was about 5 stories high, and it was most dramatic. And in the front of it, there was a statue of the Vivians, who built the copper works and brought prosperity to Swansea. Well, we were very proud to go in Ben Evans because they sold most everything. In fact, I've got in my possessions now an ostrich feather, which was bought by my auntie Janet, who lived in Cardiff, to put in her hat, and it's marked up Ben Evans, 1939, At the top floor of Ben Evans, there was a restaurant, a very, very posh restaurant, and never could we afford to go and have food there because we were a working class family and my father was unemployed. But I had an uncle who owned 3 or 4 tobacconist shops in Swansea. They were known as the West Wales Tobacco Company. His name was Edgar Adams, and he had a father, Arthur Adams, who was a distinguished businessman, quite wealthy, and who was getting married for the 2nd time. The reception was being held in the restaurant on the top floor of Ben Evans, and we as a family were invited to come along. I was a lad, as I said, and I was so excited, and up we went to the lift to the top floor where you could look right over Swansea and see the Mumbles Pier, And we sat down to the most fantastic meal. And I well remember the meal was commenced with hot, tasty tomato soup. Now, nowadays we think nothing of it, but I can assure you that tomato soup was like nectar to me. To sit down at a table with a serviette and this a waitress put in tomato soup in front of you, that was, I landed, I thought that was really royalty. And although all these years have gone by, it's now 2014, and I'm talking now about the beginning of the war, before the building was destroyed completely, that bowl of tomato soup still remains in my memory. I can even smell it. St. Mary's Church was greatly steeped in history, of course. This is about the third or the fourth church to be built on that particular site. And opposite there's a little street called Little Wine Street, in which there's a pub, the Cross Keys, which is one of the oldest pubs in Wales, but it was a hospice initially, and people without a penny to their name, completely poor, were kept allowed to stop in the hospice, and then they were taken to the church to worship St. Mary's Church. Well, St. Mary's Church was very elaborate, wonderfully built, and decor inside was breathtaking. Sadly, the Germans didn't discriminate between churches and industry, and it is bombed, and the damage was immense. The flames could be seen from Landor, alongside of David and Ben Evans, and the only structure left were the walls when the flames had put out. The fire brigade, you see, you must remember, they were very much short supplying water. There was a civilian fire service, partly enlisted policemen were in it, and they had built temporarily emergency water tanks around Swansea to supply water, because there was so much demand, the demand exceeded the supply. So very often the fire service had to allow a building to burn out if there was no lives in jeopardy, because the water was needed far more to save people's lives. So you had painted on these tanks emergency water, EMS, EWS, where the fire brigade go and put their pumps in there. They had a filter at the end of it and use water from these emergency water supply. There was a very large one, I remember, opposite New Sala Chapel in Landor, in Pentryharn Road. And in the warm, hot summer days, we used to go swimming in there, because you must remember, the baths as well were shut, you see. The Swansea Bar, Municipal Bath in St. Helens Road, by the Bayview, that was shut. So we used to swim in the emergency water tanks and in the canal and in the river. It's a pretty rude style of life in those days, but a happy days, believe it or not. Despite the dangers and the carnage, they were very happy days, because, you know, danger and stress brings people together. I well remember the story of a man who lived in a residential area, and he had a big privet hedge between his garden and the next door neighbour. But they couldn't stand the neighbour. They didn't like him at all. They quarrelled and argued. The police were called. So along came the war. So both men cut an alleyway between in this fence, and they were living together in shelters and helping each other. And the war finished, and they went back to quarrelling again. So that brings out people's attitude towards each other, and danger brings people together. Well, now the market was, in fact, and is still a national treasure, of course, regarded as one of the finest markets in the country. Swansea Market was no exception. It is built in Victorian times, and in fact the original market had been under the walls of the castle, where farmers brought in their goods and sold them there. But the Swansea Market in the 1930s was a busy and very prosperous area. There was a butcher in the market named Johnny Mabe, and he didn't have refrigeration. We're going back now to a primitive situation. So on a Saturday in the late evening, he would sell off his meat at greatly reduced prices, because he couldn't keep it until the Monday. It would start to deteriorate. So there were queues of women on a Saturday queuing to buy the cheapest meat they could possibly get, because they were very hard days financially. And I well remember, on this particular occasion, my mother and Auntie Gladys went shopping in the market and bought meat from Johnny Mabe, but they'd been invited with the family to have this meal on top of Ben Evans. So we went up, and my mother put a bag down with the meat in it, and we sat down for the meal with the tomato soup. But sadly, Gladys, my aunt, spinster aunt, had several units. And on the way home in the tram car, she was violently sick. And I well remember her being in the kitchen of 37 Sala Road, regurgitated, and saying, "Never again, never again." And my memory of Swansea Market is partly that, but I tell you something which I always remember with great joy. You could go into the market and for 4p have a big bowl of faggots and peas. That stall was down adjacent to Orange Street. There was a street called Orange Street on the one side of the market, and there was an orange pub, the Orange Pub Tree. But these stalls used to sell faggots and peas, homemade faggots, and they used to cook them on the premises, and they had wooden benches and a rude wooden table, and you could for 4p have a real feed. So the aroma of these faggots used to go out into Oxford Street, Union Street, and all the way up to the police station. Wonderful memories of Swansea Market. Then sadly it is bombed and gutted completely. So the local authorities had a temporary market in Wassell Square, but they operated on the street temporarily. In addition to the market people having temporary stalls in Wassell Square, the people from Ben Evans and David Evans and Lewis opened up shops in Walter Road. They went up to opposite St James's Church, and they took over offices there as a temporary measure to keep the business turning over, you know. And then eventually they went back to the centre of Swansea. But we did have the message, the sad news, that the only civilians had been killed up in Stowler Crescent. We were extremely upset by it because several of us had relatives living on the hill. And in fact, my father-in-law was involved with the building of Town Hill and Way Hill. He was enlisted as an unemployed man to work in labouring up on the hill there. But my local experience of bombing involved Landau, of course. I have mentioned the 5 bombs that dropped starting off in Bryn Street and ended up down in outside the viaduct in Landau. But there was also a bomb landed in Pentretrahan Road, and one of my pals had his head blown off, sadly, you know. His name was, oh dear, Mitchell, I believe, I think it was. And he was one of the people I knew closely. There was terrible college, but everyone gathered together, and ironically, they made friends with people they'd never spoken to before, you know. But generally, it molded people together. And of course you had the organisation like the Home Guard, or Local Defence Service it was, LDV initially. That brought men together. They were given, it was rather amusing really, because I remember when I was evacuated to Pontardawe, and I saw about 10 or 12 Home Guards practicing. They had broom handles, and one had a scythe. He was a farmer, and they were marching up and down the pavement, practicing to defend the land against the anticipated invasion. So this was the really Dad's army at the very beginning, you know. And they actually had broom handles. Can you imagine a broom handle being used against a submachine gun? But that was the situation. We were terribly short of food and armaments. And I went to work on a farm as a helper, which was run by a man named James. And James's son, Ronnie, was a British lightweight boxing champion. And he had a farm off Anissamond Road in Ashton. And I used to go up and help to get the cows in and take them out. And haymaking, I used to help. And they used to give me fresh eggs and bacon, which was a result of the pigs they kept on the farm. So I worked hard as a result of Adolf Hitler on a farm and had the reward of fresh eggs. My mother was delighted. Without any doubt, if anything, the Germans galvanized the character of the citizens of Swansea, and instead of causing despondency, they brought people together, and people were determined to see it through to the end, and the end came with victory. But sadly, there were lots of lives lost. But the wartime period, although it was dangerous and fatal to so many people, in a sense, it was a rich period because, as I say, it galvanized determination to fight through and defeat the evil forces which were threatening our society. In order to keep public morale up, the government decided it would be a good idea if Winston Churchill and the Queen and King at the time, King George and his wife Elizabeth, they would round the country to speak to the citizens and the dignitaries and add a bit of zest into them, the downtrodden population. And the King and Queen arrived in Swansea in a special carriage at High Street Station. Now, they were taken round a very bomb-damaged Swansea, but one of the places that they were taken to was the Guildhall. And my mother-in-law, Mrs. Nellie Phillips, was in fact involved with the civil defence. And she was so proud of it, she had a stirrup pump in the front room of her house in in Bryn Mill. But this particular day, she was asked with several of her friends to put on full uniform and to assemble opposite the Brangwyn Hall on the roadway. And so along came the Queen and the King, together with the Lord Mayor and the Lord Langcourth, who was the clerk of the court. I've got a photograph of my dear mother-in-law looking so proud. The Queen is smiling at her, and my mother-in-law is smiling even bigger. She was so proud to be there, within reach of Her Royal Highness the Queen of Britannia. Well, Churchill, yes, visit included a visit to the Bush Hotel in High Street. And there's a story, of course, which is absolutely true. The man who was driving Churchill around was a policeman named Trollope. He eventually became an inspector, but he was under a police driver. And whilst they were in the proximity of the Bush Hotel, Churchill, who inevitably had a cigar in his mouth, handed a partly smoked cigar to Trollope, P.C. Trollope, and said, "Hold this and take care of this for me while I do something here." So Trollope was left holding the cigar, partly smoked, and the Churchill never recovered it. And for years afterwards, Mr. Trollope, Inspector Trollope, kept that cigar stub in a box and proudly showed it around to everybody.